Jesus was a master storyteller. He rarely taught without using a parable. His stories were designed to make people think. There was often an obvious interpretation, then multiple deeper meanings that only became apparent when the listener took time to explore the story more fully. Our story today requires us to look closely, but also to look with a broad, overarching view of the entire gospel message. This parable appears to be rewarding bad behavior and punishing those who attempt to do right. The bridegroom is rude, showing up hours late for the celebration that has been planned in his honor. He gives no consideration for the guests who must wait with their stomachs growling, unable to begin the feast that was prepared in the banquet hall until his arrival. The wise bridesmaids are rewarded for hoarding. They didn't share from their oil surplus because there was a possibility they might not have extra by the time the groom arrived. Jesus didn't say that they definitely would run out of oil, only that they might. And the foolish bridesmaids who went off in search of more oil lost out completely. They were refused help by those who could have relieved their anxiety. They were forced to go on a frustrating shopping trip when all of the stores would have been closed. And then, after their struggle to replenish their oil, they arrived only to find they were locked out of the banquet they'd been waiting to attend, while their selfish counterparts were kicking up their heels and dancing the night away. Certainly, there must be another message to this parable. Certainly, Jesus was not advocating selfishness, rudeness, and exclusionary behavior. What did those foolish do that was so bad? How could they have known that the groom was going to be so late? Their fatal mistake wasn't falling asleep. All of the maids fell asleep while they waited. And it wasn't that they ran out of oil. Surely their friend the groom would have welcomed them to the celebration even if their lamps had gone out. Their flaw was they panicked and ran off in search of more oil. Certainly if they had stayed, if they'd let their own lamps go out but waited in the partial darkness with only the light from the other bridesmaids' lamps, they would have been allowed to enter the banquet. But the darkness overcame them, and they went off on their own to find a new source of oil to light their lamps. Just like us. When we hit those dark times in our lives, we have a hard time sitting tight, waiting for more light to arrive. Either waiting for a helper, or waiting for a new understanding, or waiting for God to reveal to us what it is that will bring us out of our dark pit. We seek relief from the dark by chasing after our own solutions, rather than by trusting God and waiting. We try to force the darkness out of our spirits with busyness, or overindulgence in food or alcohol, or in spending, trying to buy happiness. We run from our inner selves, trying to find another person who will make us feel better. But there's great potential for growth in those dark times. There's great opportunity to connect with God if we will trust and will allow the darkness to slow us down for a bit. When we trust that God will restore our light in the right time, we can rest in the darkness. The sin of the foolish bridesmaids was running off. They bailed instead of waiting a bit longer. And what about those wise ones? Was Jesus really making an example of their selfish behavior? Did he honor their hoarding? Or did they receive grace and were allowed to go in simply because they were present? Both the wise and the foolish were concerned about their lamps and whether they would be burning brightly or not. They both had an economy of scarcity when it came to light. Neither of them was able to trust the love of the bride and groom for them. Neither trusted the friendship to be strong enough to accept them if they weren't able to provide a value, a bit of light for the celebration. The wise weren't rewarded for being selfish, for worrying about not being enough. They were welcomed into the banquet because they were present. And the inconsiderate groom who kept everyone waiting, he still got to be the center of attention and celebration. Traditionally, when we Christians hear this parable, we think of Christians as the wise bridesmaids, and non-believers or former believers who are now backsliders as the foolish. And then we place Jesus in the role as the groom, returning in his triumphal second coming to gather in the faithful. But if we think of the Jesus that we know and love, this groom can't be a metaphor for him. The character of the groom is all wrong. The story as it is recorded in our scriptures doesn't match traditions for the time. The bride and groom would have been arriving together at the feast. The bride's friends would have been waiting for her and her husband, not just for the groom. If the story had included her, as it probably did when Jesus originally told it, we wouldn't be able to interpret it as Jesus being the groom. Our scriptural references to Jesus as groom include the church as his bride. If this reflects a wedding banquet, as it would have been celebrated then, it can't be a metaphor for the second coming. Jesus will be coming to gather in the church, not bringing it with him when he returns. The gospel was written at a time when the religious leaders were busy re-establishing boundaries. They were drawing in the faithful and building barriers to keep out any of those people who were wandering astray. Remember, the first Christians were Jews who had attached themselves to the teachings of Jesus. From the perspective of the religious leaders, they were dangerous heretics that needed to be excluded from contaminating the faithful with their seemingly false beliefs. They'd run off after a different source of light and were now outsiders in their faith tradition. Later, when we continue reading in Matthew, we find clues to better interpret this parable. Later, Jesus tells us who will be in and who will be left out. It isn't about who has and who doesn't have. It's about who's faithful, who cares for others. Jesus says that whoever cares for the least, whoever gives a drink of cold water to a child or visits the sick or clothes the naked will be welcomed into his presence. The ones who refused to care for the least will not be recognized as his followers. So rather than reading this parable and thinking of the second coming, with greedy believers getting in and poor people being excluded, we read it as a message for the present day. Present day in first century Palestine and present day for us today. Will we be like the wise who hoarded what they had just in case they might need it later? If so, our reward will be short-lived. We'll have the benefit of our bounty now, but we won't be recognized later when Jesus gathers in those who cared for others. Will we be like the groom who locked the doors tightly to keep the outsiders out? Then our reward will be short-lived. We'll have our banquet now, but won't be recognized later when Jesus gathers in those who cared for others. Will we be like the foolish who couldn't endure the challenges of the darkness and ran off in search of more light? Jesus calls us to trust. It's a short word that rolls off the tongue very easily, but it's a whole lot easier to say it than to do it. I thought I was pretty good at trusting Jesus. I thought I understood that I'm in control of only the superficial pieces of my life and that God is actually in control of the majority of my life's journey. I thought I had developed the ability to rest in God, trusting the uncertainty of the moment. Then I had to face CPE. I did my best to get exempted from the requirement, but my begging didn't work. So I spent the summer in high anxiety, worried about what would happen to my life when fall arrived and I had to fit so many hours into an already full schedule. I worried about my finances, especially when I discovered that the website had inaccurate information and that I'd have to close my office every Monday for 17 weeks, which actually was 18 weeks because Labor Day fell into that block of time, instead of class time being offered evenings like the website said. I worried about transportation because my car was getting old and needed some major work to be dependable. I worried about my health. Exhaustion and sleep deprivation are not good for the immune system, and I would be exposed to all kinds of ick as I visited people in the hospital. I worried about having a flare of fibromyalgia pain because of the physical and emotional demands on my body. I spent the summer running around looking for oil for my lamp. I lost a lot of rest and endured a lot of anxiety because I was trying to be my own source. And something amazing happened. God showed me who was in control. I was able to replace my car with something that gets great gas mileage, so the savings in fuel alone are covering my car payment. God gave me a free car. With transportation cares taken care of, and a piece of my financial burden was solved all in one amazing miracle. Maybe God might be able to get me through the time crunch too. But being on duty for 24 hours and not being able to take the next day off is certainly not going to work. I knew that, except it does. I don't know how, other than to say it's a God thing. But I managed to get through my time at the hospital, sometimes with a teeny tiny nap, sometimes without, and then I managed to drive home safely. And when my alarm goes off a few short hours after I finally get to crawl into my bed, I wake up and start the next day. I've completed 10 weeks of that cycle. 10 weeks of functioning from about 5:30 on Monday morning until about 10 o'clock on Wednesday evening with a total of about 6 to 8 hours of broken sleep. Guess what I'm learning? If God calls you to something, God will be faithful to carry you through it. I'm not trying to find my own oil. I'm not using energy drinks. I'm not relying on caffeine. I can't, because if I'm wired on caffeine, I won't be able to catch those tiny bits of sleep when time permits. I'm trusting God, and it's working. Of course, it helps to know that it's short term. I only have 6 more 24-hour shifts to accomplish. And it helps to have support from a number of people who are making this time easier for me. People who God placed in my life, not people I looked for. The beauty of the parable is, as we place ourselves in the various characters of the story, we're able to dance from one role to another, learning lessons for ourselves from the actions of those characters. We don't need to hoard. We can share from our bounty. In God's economy, there is no scarcity. God provides enough. Enough energy, enough strength, enough endurance, enough of whatever it is we have to have in order to live out the great commandment to love. We don't need to run off in search of our own source of light. God is our source. Even in the deepest, darkest times of our life, God provides the light we need to find our way. We don't need to lock and bolt the doors to keep people out. God creates the guest list, and everybody is invited to the banquet. May we be willing to rest in the security of knowing God is in control. May we trust God to care for us so that we can care for others, all those people we think of as other, whom God loves.